The movie we've just seen leads us to believe Lizzie Borden may have been guilty and offers the theory that she killed her father and her stepmother in the nude. Joining us now to assess the movie's history and tell us about the real Lizzie Borden is Professor Steven Nissenbaum of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Welcome.
Thank you.
Was she guilty?
I don't think there's much choice. There's nobody else who could have done it. She must have been guilty.
Why didn't the jury find her guilty?
That's always been a tough question. My best take on that is that the jury consisted of a lot of upstanding men like Lizzie Borden's father, Andrew, but not nearly so wealthy. They were respectable, struggling to get wealthy. And I think that they hoped and very much wanted to believe that if they could become wealthy as Andrew Borden was, that would bring domestic peace within their families, because domestic peace was something they really craved. And I think that the notion that this daughter could have killed her parents would have just completely threatened their belief that wealth brought inner security.
Every time the movie left me is when it went into that scene in her eyes, stream of consciousness. She's looking through the door. Her father's got a big hypodermic needle. He puts his hands on. Is that a corpse?
It's a corpse. It's a corpse he's preparing.
What's that all about?
For burial. The movie seems to be making a rather, what I think is a rather bizarre sort of Freudian implication about what was going on, and that is that Andrew Jackson Borden, that was his name, Andrew Borden, sexually abused the women corpses that he was preparing for burial, and furthermore, that Lizzie witnessed this, and that somehow this led to some kind of weird sexual attraction between the two. That leaves me way out as a historian. And in fact, it seems to me as a good retrospective guide to viewing this movie, it's useful to think that whenever the movie is showing what happens in the present, it's really pretty accurate. The costuming, the sets are all really quite good. But when the camera begins to move into Lizzie's eyes, and then we are moving into Lizzie's head, that's when the movie begins to engage in these kinds of bizarre Freudian and sexual speculations, which I think are totally misplaced.
But she wouldn't commit the murder as the movie would have us believe in her birthday suit, would she?
That's really interesting, because if there's one thing that's even more difficult to believe than the possibility that Lizzie Borden actually killed her father and stepmother, and killed them that violently, if there's one thing that's even harder to believe, it's that she would have killed them in the nude. That's impossible for me to imagine that an aspiring young lady of that generation would have done. She would have worn whole sets of undergarments underneath her outer garment. She would have never taken some of those undergarments off. It's possible that Lizzie never was in the nude, not even at night. She was, after all, an unmarried woman. That's absolutely impossible for me to believe.
Well, if she was demented, didn't that house itself contribute to her dementia?
The house certainly contributed to what we might think of as tensions within the household, because the construction, the physical construction of the house is really quite interesting. There was no hallway space in the house to get from one room into another room, including the upstairs bedrooms. You had to walk through someone else's room. So there was no way to achieve any privacy in that house. And since there were tensions within the household to begin with, those tensions were simply exaggerated and exacerbated by the physical structure of the house. I would say it wasn't simply Lizzie that was suffering from some kind of dementia. It was the entire family, as evidenced by the physical house in which they lived.
Well, Mr. Borden had money. Why didn't they move or get a better architect?
Now that gets us really, I think, to the secret and real inner history of the Borden family. Andrew Borden was a member of a very wealthy Fall River family, the Borden clan, but he was a peripheral member of that family. He started off with only a little bit of money, worked his way up by himself. He never thought of himself as a member of the local aristocracy. He never thought of himself as a rich man. I'm sure that Andrew Borden, to his dying day, thought of himself as a poor man who had a lot of money and not as a rich man. And he was perfectly satisfied with the house he was living in. For Lizzie Borden, she grew up in another cultural world, within one family, but another world. And for her, the house was not fine at all.
What was the world for a woman who's past 30?
The world for a single woman
That's right.
who's past 30, as Lizzie Borden was, is a world whose walls, as it were, are closing in. Just as the walls of the house were closing in on Lizzie, she must have felt that the walls of marriageability were also closing in on her. She desperately wanted to get out of that house. She'd wanted to for years. Her father had no intention of moving away. She knew that the Borden family was very long-lived. Her grandfather lived to be into his 90s. She couldn't count on her father dying. So she had to get out of that house. She committed those murders, and I assume that she did commit them, 3 weeks or so after her 32nd birthday, just the age when she would have realized that marriage, the one avenue out of that house, was closed to her.
The issue is Lizzie Borden lives and vibrates in our life, and I can't understand why. What is that fascinates us about her?
All I can say about that is that Americans have been fascinated with the prospect that families, wealthy families, can go wrong. Americans remain fascinated by murder within the family, even more than by murder by strangers. Despite all of our fear of crime today, it really seems to me that the greatest anxiety that Americans have today, and perhaps had 100 years ago when the Lizzie Borden murders occurred, are for the possibilities of violence within the most intimate domestic unit, the family.
What happened to her afterward?
After she was acquitted, she did what she always wanted to do. She moved to a fashionable neighborhood up on the hill, and she remained there for the rest of her life, almost 40 years. It's intriguing that Lizzie never chose to leave Fall River. If I had been Lizzie Borden, I would have just gotten out of town. I would have had enough money to do it, could have moved to Boston, could have moved to New York, anywhere I wanted, to get away from that terrible local notoriety. But the fact that Lizzie stayed in town and moved to that fashionable house up on the hill suggests exactly how passionately she must have been aspiring to exactly that future.
And no more.
And no more.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're very welcome.
I'm Sander Van Oker for Movies in Time. Thanks for watching.